back to Unsolicited Advice, brought to you by Toxic Bubblegum. I'm Bubblegum.
I'm Toxic.
And today we're talking about public domain things.
Yes.
So the reason we chose this topic was in order to... We just launched our newest show on our channel called 40 Unsolicited Literature, where Kat and I get a little bit inebriated, and Kat retells good old public domain stories, and I illustrate them with incredible skill.
Yes.
And it's not a pain to edit at all.
No. I absolutely wouldn't do anything to Alan that would be a pain to edit.
No, you wouldn't. You.
So, yes, our quote, which I definitely have in the notes,
Mm-hmm.
and didn't bring up now.
I
can't go back to yesterday because I was a different person then.
That would be Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
I love that one.
It's good. It's a good quote.
It is a good quote.
From the public domain. Yes.
So, yeah. How do we want to get started on this? Part 1 appears to be public domain laws.
Yes.
And as we all know, I'm very up to date on laws and things, and I absolutely am not.
All right.
So,
yeah, I have a little thing that I'm just gonna get through fast.
let's do it.
All right.
Speed run.
Long story short, public domain legislation, like all copyright legislation, is very complicated and varies based off of both location and circumstance. For instance, copyrights in New Mexico are longer than copyrights in other countries, and America has a very specific clause where copyright lasts 19 years on all books that are, or 95 years, I've written on all books between 1924 and 1978. This is assuming that the rights to the work have just expired and haven't been either bought or altered. A general rule of thumb is that a creator's base of work enters the public domain on January 1st of the 70th year anniversary of their death. This is not legally binding, it's just a generalization of a very complicated issue. And basically what we're saying here is that if you're going to do any kind of public domain adaptation that you plan to sell or distribute or make a profit from, do your research going into the project so that you know whether or not it is actually under public domain, and double check to make sure that you're not infringing on anybody else's copyright. And then, so do your research. Some really fantastic resources that you can use are Project Gutenberg, which makes ebooks for everything in the public domain, and if you prefer to do audiobooks, LibriVox does the same thing.
Ooh,
so
fancy.
Yes. So you have options, and those are just general guidelines for public domain.
Right, and obviously, as with everything, it's never as simple as it first appears.
For instance, in 40 Ounces to Freedom, Alan and I
40 Ounces of Freedom?
40 Ounces to Literature.
Stop saying the name of the song!
There's a Sublime song called 40 Ounces to Freedom.
It's a reference.
The worst part is that that's not even the song that plays in my head. When I say 40 Ounces to Freedom, I hear 2 joints.
Why?
Because I smoke 2 joints in the morning. I smoke 2 joints at night.
Oh,
I smoke 2 joints before I smoke 2 joints. It makes me feel alright. Sublime, not in the public domain.
Double 2 to stop you.
Alright, that's fair. In 40 Ounces to Literature.
Yes.
In our show that I know the name of.
I thought you were going to say Freedom again, honestly.
And I'm not
I heard you
this
pause.
time. In that, we actually made a mistake. We got a list of stories in the public domain that we can do, and we recorded one for The Great Gatsby, which actually has a special clause in it where the copyright exceeds.
That's right.
So we can't do one of those episodes until 2021.
Oh, but that's okay. Well,
so it's coming soon.
I'll have plenty of time to edit it.
Yeah.
It'll be great.
Yeah.
But that's okay, because we can do tests of the Gerbervilles instead. And let me tell you, I'm excited to edit that one. There are a lot of fucking cows.
There are so many cows.
We only talk about cows like once. Anyway. But yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you gotta sort of know what you're getting into with it, because you never know when something like The Great Gatsby has a special clause.
Yeah.
That you need, so you need to still buy the rights to The Great Gatsby now.
And then there are also things. There are some works that have indefinite copyright laws. Oh no.
Oh no. Keep going.
All right.
I have to deal with this cat.
So yeah, it's just like Peter Pan, not in the public domain, never going to be in the public domain. There are exceptions made legally for like specific uses, but it is covered by a different thing. So yeah. And this is something that we're going to talk about a little later on in the advice portion of our podcast, but if you're doing an adaptation of something, you want to research it anyway, so it doesn't hurt to put in that little extra effort right at the beginning to cover copyright. Yeah.
Yeah. So, because as with anything that you have to do any sort of research into, you should always do that first.
Yes.
Because that's just good. That's just good practice.
It's a good thing.
As it turns out. So, Peter Pan isn't in the public domain?
No. Peter Pan is copyrighted in England, and they have a special thing for Peter Pan.
Of course.
It's like a very Great Gatsby-esque situation, except for there are some things that are just covered in what is called indefinite copyright, to protect it from Creative Commons laws.
Yeah.
And it's a whole legislative nightmare, let me tell you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I know England's having a fun time with all that stuff right now.
Yeah.
It's
more complicated now than it is even usually.
Right.
But yeah, so that's the basic stuff for that.
That's like the boring legal stuff.
I did a lot of research into this, and actually sometime we'll do Cat's fun law facts.
Oh.
But
yay.
Because I actually thought it was really interesting. I was like, we're not going to get into it today, and I'm going to immediately launch into it.
Oh, here we go!
They actually, the concept of copyright law goes back to the Roman Empire.
Really?
They didn't have any of the terms that we use today to legislate it, but they were like the first people who came up with the basic concept of intellectual property.
Right.
Pretty much. So they had the idea of a public domain before there were words to describe it. And the legislation came into it in, I think it was like 1710, was the first time that there was like a copyright law put into place. And then France and England came into developing terminology for it at the same time.
Huh.
At around the same time in like the 18th and 19th. In the 18th century, it became more of a thing, and then in the 19th century, they started like actually putting public domain into. That's where like the term public domain came from. Yeah.
That's fun.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was so old.
Yeah. And it's fun because the concept kind of outdates the terminology for it.
Like, by a lot.
Yeah.
As it turns out.
Whoopsie! But yeah. We've got the, propriété publique and the publici juris.
So fancy.
Yeah.
So...
Which
so
are
many words.
Root terms for what we've got today.
Woohoo!
So yeah, those are my fun legislation fun facts.
You have an interesting definition of fun, my friend. I adore you. So interesting.
Yeah. But that's where we're at. So part 2.
Part 2! And what are we doing for part 2? We're doing the best and worst examples of public domain adaptations. Oh boy!
Yeah, I chose 3 things that I figured we could both talk about.
Okay.
That had really good and really bad adaptations. Yeah.
Oh, this one is especially timely. Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, Sherlock Holmes.
So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. As it turns out, the most, the biggest ones at the moment are still Elementary and Sherlock, BBC's Sherlock.
Yeah.
Even though BBC Sherlock has fallen out of fashion quite a bit. But those are still, like, the ones I think of the most.
Right.
As recent adaptations.
And it's fun, because that pretty much sums up my favorite and least favorite Sherlock Holmes adaptation. As it turns out.
Whoopsie.
Hot take.
Very hot take.
I like Benedict Cumberbatch.
We all knew that, Kat.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was gonna say, the most recent of all disastrous adaptations, would be Holmes and Watson.
Oh boy.
As it turns out, because that is a movie that just happened and bombed hard.
I keep forgetting that's a thing.
That's because everyone should forget that that's a thing, probably. A whopping fucking, like, 9% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yeah.
I believe it was a disaster. But yeah, so how do we want to talk about how they're the best and the worst?
Oh, yeah. Do you want to... I figured we'd each, like, talk about our favorite and why we thought it was the best.
Okay.
And then each talk about our least favorite and why we thought it was the worst.
Okay.
Just do it that way?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right. Do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
You start.
Benedict Cumberbatch is sexy. No.
Stop that.
That's not what makes a good adaptation.
That right now.
Because, and I'm gonna get a little bit ahead of myself here, because Robert Downey Jr. is also very sexy, and I did not like him as Sherlock Holmes. Didn't like it. So feel free to cast sexy actors, but don't let them carry the adaptation. Don't do it. But if they are sexy and it's a good adaptation anyway, just saying.
Kat, you gotta
Sherlock.
You gotta move on.
Okay.
Don't make it weird.
What I liked about Sherlock, and we talked about this a little bit in the pre-show. My favorite Sherlock Holmes story is Study in Scarlet, and when they did the pilot episode, covered it, and it brought it into the modern world without losing any of the characteristics that made Sherlock Holmes who he was. And you could say the same thing about any of the characters in there. They did a good job updating everyone, and when we finally did get to Moriarty, Andrew Scott is my favorite Moriarty. The casting was exceptional, and later on, it was not as good.
When we got to season 3 and it was fan fiction.
Yeah. And actually, there was a tiny fangirl part of me that really liked the pilot of season 3, because I was like, because it's one of those things you kind of hope something will happen, and you see it, and there's that moment where you feel just vindicated. You're like, yeah, it happened, and then you're like, should it have? Really, though? Really? In real? I don't know about that. But yeah, for the most part, I'm in referring to the first couple seasons, and they did a really good job adding depth without changing the essence of what the story was. And it felt more honest. What I liked about it was it felt like reading Sherlock Holmes. It felt like reading the stories, even though it was a different setting and changes had been made to the characters. Nothing was changed so much that it felt like not Sherlock Holmes. And also intelligent writing. There were flaws in the writing.
Right.
But it was very intelligently done. And I feel like when you're covering something that's such an intellectual concept, you really have to have writers who know what they're doing.
Right, you need clever writers to know what they're doing. So I would say it's also... So here's the thing, is I haven't watched a whole bunch of Sherlock adaptations. I named several of them. I really only watched BBC Sherlock. I'm gonna be honest and transparent here. But I mean, the first 2 seasons, obviously have their flaws, but I did really enjoy them while I was watching them. Like, I thought particularly the Hounds of Baskerville, had a lot of imagery that stuck with me. I thought it was really cool. It really kind of kept the twists and turns, and really had a detective story feel to it, where you're following the detective and his foray into learning the mysteries. And I feel like the first 2 seasons did that exceptionally well. Like, there were a couple of times they sort of slipped on it, but for the most part, you were really following the story as it was being uncovered and solved.
Right.
Which, as I understand, is how Sherlock Holmes is supposed to be.
And it's also something, because Sherlock Holmes, in the stories, he was a very complex character.
Yeah.
Even at a time where characterization wasn't as much of a focus in stories as it is today. He was very intelligent. He knew a lot of stuff. He got very invested in things, but he also had a lot of issues. And I feel like in a lot of Sherlock Holmes adaptations, they go too far with it one way or the other, where it's like he's an enigma and he can do no wrong. He just gets stuff off the bat, genius, God. Or they go the other way where it's like he's like really clumsy and a little silly, and you know, he's not someone who you can really respect. And what I liked about BBC Sherlock is they did a good job making sure that you knew he was both.
Right.
And my favorite, it's one of my favorite things from Study in Scarlet that they brought up into the show. I really like, because when they're describing Sherlock Holmes I don't know if it was like the first thing, but like one of the earliest descriptions of Sherlock Holmes is it's talking about how he can piece together all these details, and he has just this immense amount of knowledge related to what he does, but he doesn't understand how the solar system works. And it's like they showed that dichotomy in the show really well. I thought it was like a big joke in the show that he doesn't know that the Earth goes around the sun.
Oh no.
Even though he's very highly intelligent. And yeah. And you can see in the show that he's not used to being picked on for being an idiot about some stuff. Because Watson's like, you know, do you really not know how the solar system works? And he's like, if we went around the sun or the moon, it wouldn't make a difference. And it's like,
it does, no. No, it does. No.
But it doesn't help him solve mysteries.
Whoops. Well, I mean, it could.
It could have in that situation, honestly. But yeah.
So, I mean, so I guess the only other adaptation I've seen of Sherlock Holmes, which I guess by default makes it the worst in my mind, is the Robert Downey Jr. ones, which I'm not going to be honest, I didn't hate, but I don't remember them at all. Like, I didn't bother to see the second one. I saw the first one and it happened at me, I feel like. And I mean, like, I didn't leave hating it, but I wasn't enthused. I was just sort of a filler movie between other movies.
Yeah.
Which is, I think it goes back to the writing of it, because I felt like it was more of an adventure action film than a detective story. Like, it didn't have a big sense of atmosphere. The only thing I do remember about it really is sort of that they had the action scenes in there. And I'm not saying you can't do an action detective Sherlock, but that wasn't the way to do it, because I never felt like...
You have to make sure you have the essence of Sherlock before you can start adding stuff to it.
Right.
And that was my big problem with the Robert Downey Jr. movies, is that he seemed he seemed too silly.
Yeah, he was sort of goofy, and I mean...
Like, not invested in the mystery portion, and then there were, like, these cool action scenes that they used to sell the movie, but there was not a lot of that intelligence, there was not a lot of that, like, mystery solving. He just kind of happened into stuff, because he was messing around.
Right, which, I mean, like, that can be a fun way to do a detective story, but that's not Sherlock Holmes.
It felt almost like a really action-packed, like a Dirk Gently.
Yeah.
Kind of a...
And that's the thing, is I love Dirk Gently.
Right.
I think Dirk Gently. Dirk Gently's holistic detective agency is a great thing that exists in this world, and I really need to finish watching it.
Yes. And you need to read Long Dark Tea Time.
I do need to read... I need to do a lot of things in my life.
I know. It's just Long Dark Tea Time is a comedic modern take on Norse mythology.
That's literally
that should be at like the top of your list.
I got a half-hour commute to work now. I can get the audiobook. But yeah. But I think that's one of the things we're gonna cover in when you advice for doing is when you are adapting something, you need to have some sort of spirit of the original in there.
Yeah.
Which Bumbling Idiot Detective is not Sherlock Holmes.
Right. It's an aspect of him, but it's like a very small fraction of who he was.
Right.
And to make that his entire personality it rang very hollow. I'm just gonna throw this in here. I don't like Elementary. I've only seen an episode of it, and I didn't like it for a lot of reasons. I quit watching because at the time I was a lot better about like, I don't like this, I'm not going to keep doing it.
Right.
Than I am now, because now I'll just stick with stuff again.
Right.
Back there. But it's one of those things. A big part of what really turned me off to Elementary, outside of like writing issues I had in the pilot episode, I really didn't like the marketing for Elementary. Mm-hmm. And this, again, it kind of falls into an advice thing, but it's like, because I think that doing different takes on stuff and having, sort of like public domain AUs essentially is what Elementary was. And I don't think there's a problem with it, but there are like not enough stories where we've got like, where we've got buddies solving crime together and it's not like a weird relationship thing. And it's something I really liked about Sherlock Holmes, reading them, and then it's something I really like because the BBC Sherlock, it kind of leans into you don't know what they are, but they never pressed on it too much. The fandom did for sure, but like the show itself, it was like a very subtle relationship where they're just close, and seeing two men care about each other and be close and not have it be like a huge point of interest in the behind the writers. I think that's something that we really didn't get enough of, and Sherlock expanded on that, and I really liked it. And then Elementary is like, what if Watson was a sexy lady? And it's like, I don't like this. And it, again, I didn't get that tone as much from like watching the pilot, but it was something that the marketing did a lot, where it's like in the promos and stuff there was like so much sexual tension going on there, and it's like, I don't want to. I'm sure it's not as bad in the show as, because they always make stuff look worse in the promos, but it did really, as much as I try not to let it, it really tainted my whole perception of the show.
And it sucks because Lucy Liu is such a great actress.
I love Lucy Liu.
But it's like when something is marketed so poorly, it sort of overshadows any sort of potential it does have, and that's in the actual show, because you sort of get a bad taste of it from the get-go. And listen, I love sexy ladies as much as the next person, but like if you're gonna take something, and I'm not opposed to developing like a friends to lovers relationship, it's one of my favorite tropes.
Right.
But if one of the things about it, because the thing with Watson had a life outside of Sherlock, and his wife or his girlfriend was one of those things outside of his relationship with Sherlock. So I feel like sort of putting them in a romantic relationship is counterproductive to the intricacies of their relationship.
It's
as just like a, oh, will they, won't they sort of thing. It's like, no, they start off as complete strangers and then develop this interesting bond.
Yeah. I would also, again, general rule of thumb, I would never recommend throwing a gender swap and a relationship shift.
Yeah.
Into the same adaptation of something. Because, like, again, the relationship between Watson and Sherlock, it's what we read for. And it's like, if someone had continued Sherlock Holmes in a TV show where they're like, I want Watson and Sherlock to end up together, and they had gone for it and committed, it's like, okay, sure. Or if they had been like, I want Watson to be a lady, and it's like the same relationship, I would have been like, okay.
Because there's not nearly enough of those in adaptations either.
Right.
It's just platonic relationships. There's a lot of things that just lack platonic relationships, especially in a heteronormative society where if there's a leading man and a leading woman, they usually end up together, and it's like, they don't have to.
They don't.
Hot take.
But
Sure,
what I also would have liked to see, let's see if we can get the funding for this.
Okay.
Because this sounds great. Lucy Liu.
Yes.
In a Sherlock Holmes adaptation.
Yeah.
Where Watson and Sherlock are both ladies. Platonic friends.
Yes.
But they're both, like, I would have liked that better.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I would have also liked that. If you're gonna do a gender swap, I feel like you might as well go all out for it.
If Irene Adler had been, like, a sexy dude who showed up and was like...
Oh, stop. Stop right now.
Just saying.
I'm too gay for this.
It would have been great.
I'm too bisexual for this cat.
And it would have been really interesting, because I think that's the other thing, too, is, like, and we're gonna cover this again a little bit in advice, but it's like, because one of the biggest things that was lacking in Sherlock Holmes was that there weren't a lot of powerful female characters, Irene Adler being, like, the one exception.
Right.
And I think Sherlock's downfall, where it was maybe not handled as well as Elementary, was that they focused a little bit more on the women, but they didn't bring in that many more women who were, like, strong and powerful, and they let Stephen Moffat has a bit of a track record in not writing women the best, and instead of getting, like, a female writer consultant on to be like, hey, this is how you should handle Irene Adler, they didn't do that thing, and it was weird when she left, honestly.
Yeah, I was like...
she was sexy as hell while she was on the show, but then, like, as they were getting her off the show, it's like, what am I supposed to be taking away from this?
Right, what am I supposed to be...
I didn't know.
...doing here with this? But yeah, so, there are ups and downs and everything, but I feel like if you're gonna switch things up, you should really commit to switching things up. Because and this is also something we're gonna talk about in advice, is that there is a reason to switch and diversify lots of things that are adapted because, well, we'll get into that later. But yeah.
And before we move on to our next public domain thing, I just want to throw in here really fast that they were terrible, but I loved the PC Sherlock Holmes games where Watson was a weeping angel and they just never talk about it. It's so good. Okay.
He's here now.
You turn around and Watson's just there.
That's Christ. That's terrifying.
It's so scary. I love it so much. Yeah.
So yeah. So you have another one on here that I've actually never really seen an adaptation of.
You have, and that's why I want to talk about it.
So it's The Scarlet Letter is the one that we're talking about now. What?
Easy A.
Oh my god, you're right, it is!
Yeah. And I actually... Yeah, I thought you might want to talk about that. I thought it would be, like, an interesting pick.
Oh, it's been a while since I've seen Easy A. But... that's true.
It's my choice for, like, top adaptation, because it did something new and fun with, like, a really old concept, and it mixed, like, that ostracizing of women from way back when it was written into like, a high school comedy movie.
And I think it also did, like, where I felt, because I don't really remember the ending of the Scarlet Letter, but I mean, I feel like it was bad.
Yeah.
For Hester Prynne, like totally bad. Whereas the ending of Easy A was like upbeat and uplifting,
Yeah.
and like it sort of put the modern non-misogynistic spin on what the story could be.
Yeah.
Because I mean that's sort of the thing about the Scarlet Letter is it's a little bit hot and misogynistic because I mean, and that's the whole thing about it.
Right.
I don't know why we still have to read it all the time, but whatever. Classics be like that, I guess. But yeah, it also just has some great writing. I always remember the fucking scenes. Like, you guys, I'm adopted. Who told you? It's
and then,
so funny.
And then she won't say the word that she said in class, so she spells it out with the P's.
God.
It's like, I accept that challenge. She gets right to it. It's like and it's got all of the things that you want from from the genre of movie that they picked, which is not what you associate with the Scarlet Letter, but it got the genre down. It's got the memorable moments. It's got a lot of quotable one-liners. It was good. It's a fun time. I don't usually get sucked into those sorts of movies, but Easy A is one of my favorites.
Is that the one with the card? Is that the one where she's
with the pocket full of sunshine and she's in the shower?
Yeah, and she's like, I hate this, and then by the end of the weekend.
Yeah.
But yeah. So yeah, I totally forgot that was an adaptation.
Yeah.
And that's I think one of the things that signifies a really successful adaptation is it can stand on its own.
Yeah.
Just fine.
Yeah, and you can think about it, and I think if you hadn't read The Scarlet Letter, you might not even, because they talk about how they point out the similarities. They're reading The Scarlet Letter in class,
right?
And she gets the inspiration for the whole thing from The Scarlet Letter, but as they're but you can watch it and you could not really realize how much of an adaptation it really is and how thematically similar they are.
Right. Oh, that's great. Oh, that makes me so happy. I totally forgot.
Thought you would like that.
I do.
Yeah.
It's also one of those things where there are a lot of things that don't get adapted. And I mean, that's because, sometimes they just don't fit.
Yeah.
But it's sort of the thing, it proves if you write it smart enough, you really can adapt most things.
And it's good. It's something that I also really like about Easy A, because Nathaniel Hawthorne's book it looks at, here's stuff that's wrong with society and this is how women are treated and it's bad, but look at it a whole bunch throughout this book.
Right.
Whereas Easy A, Olive kind of looks at it and she's like, I'm going to embrace this thing.
Right.
And she's kind of the one who does it all to herself, you know? Because she's just she's turning the tables to use all the stereotypes and the rumors and stuff to her advantage.
Right.
And it, it's good.
It's good. I like it.
There's my own weird movie recommendation.
This episode is sponsored by Easy A. Real timely.
And the least favorite example of a Scarlet Letter adaptation is pretty much any movie adaptation of the Scarlet Letter that isn't Easy A.
Yeah. I've never even really heard of one. I can't even think.
They had
of
one
anything
with that actress. They had one with a really famous actress in it, but it was just I slept through it. It was
I feel like we had to watch it in class.
There
or
was
something,
no way that you
was...
can take the actual source material and just put that on the screen and have it be as relevant or as interesting as the book was, because a lot of the best part of the Scarlet Letter is the writing, and once you take that away,
right.
You're just like, what am I watching?
Why am I doing this to myself? I could do anything else. I could be watching Easy A right now.
Yeah. You could be.
Could be. Maybe we should.
Maybe we should watch Easy A. But yeah.
Yeah. That's a fun one.
That's my
Yeah. And now it's time for the deep dive section
dive.
with our number one top pick for public domain adaptation material.
Mm-hmm.
It's Alice in Wonderland!
Alice in Wonderland time.
We're here again, as always.
Yes.
So, as anyone who's listened to this podcast knows, we love Alice in Wonderland a lot. I just got me and Kat matching Alice in Wonderland journals.
They're so cute.
Because they're so cute. It's sort of ridiculous. But yeah, so where do we want to start with this? So this is one of those things.
It's crazy, because there are so many. I've read and watched so many Alice in Wonderland adaptations. I'm not going to say all of them, because there are literally more coming out every day. But I'd say a majority of at least the published ones I've gotten through. And I think you and I still are going to have the same best and the same worst.
Yeah, probably.
That's my prediction.
I want to go ahead and list off that best one.
American McGee's Alice.
Yes.
Madness Returns.
Oh, it's so good. So this is one of those cases where we talked about having the spirit of the original in there. So obviously American McGee's Alice shifts really hard.
Yeah.
Because as with any of the American McGee's stuff, it's dark.
Dark.
But I feel like it still keeps sort of the wondrous tone of it while taking it to a very dark place.
Yes.
And it's something I particularly really like about the Madness Returns is because it does sort of take this of this girl whose innocence has been corrupted and her trying to not reclaim it but get to a better place in general with herself. So yeah, do you want to talk about the first game a little bit? Because you're way more versed in that than I am.
Yeah, the first game was pretty much a lot of my... Well, while most kids were doing things that had like a lot of kids material for kids to explore, I was playing American McGee's Alice over and over and over. It was like, I wasn't super into any kind of gaming community at the time, but it was like, that was like my exposure to challenge runs and stuff, because like as I ran out of content in the game and as I started being able to play on Nightmare and stuff, it was like, how can I make this harder so that it's challenging so that I can play it again? And it was like, I would do challenge runs myself where it's like, I can only use a certain weapon or, you know... And it was just a great game for gaming's sake. But as an adaptation, it was pretty dark for a child to be playing, arguably.
We both had parents that were surprisingly lenient with the tone of the content they let us play.
Yeah. But it's one of those things. I loved Alice in Wonderland. And I loved horror, and it was such a seamless interpretation of two of my all-time favorite things. And we're going to be edging in a little bit more to Madness Returns, but what I really liked about the first game was it lay the Wonderland groundwork, whereas Madness Returns was a lot more about the story outside of Wonderland. American McGee's Alice just really, really laid solid groundwork for what Wonderland was supposed to be like.
Right, and it also did because it's not a short game.
No.
It's, like, really long, and I mean, like, it did a lot of world building in itself. And it was sort of this wondrous but twisted sort of place where I feel like, in the spirit of Alice in Wonderland, anything could happen.
Yeah.
You just had to learn how to roll with it and how to navigate the world.
Yeah.
I think it was good.
It was a really good game. And it kept a lot of the wondrous elements from the story, even in such a dark environment, you know? Meta Essence is, like, the prettiest stuff in the, like... crazy beautiful. It's pretty much its life force. It's like how you heal yourself in the game, but it's like, it's one of those things where you get it from killing enemies, and there's like a bunch of blood and stuff going on, but then you get like these little, essentially health globes that you run over, and it was just like, it felt like a bigger deal than just like picking up something to heal yourself.
Right.
Like you really there were just little elements like that really sucked you into the beauty of what you were experiencing.
And I think one of the nice things it did, so usually there are popular Alice in Wonderland characters like we've seen in the Tim Burton adaptations, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later.
Yeah, spoiler alert.
Spoiler. As if we haven't talked about that enough. But it's, so, like, obviously there's the Mad Hatter, there's the March Hare, there's the Dormouse, there's the White Rabbit, there's, like, your typical cast of characters you think of.
Yeah.
But what American McGee does is really takes as much of it as it can. So, like
the Duchess and the Mock Turtle
and the Griffin and like, so all these characters that had about as big a role as the other ones they did because the Mad Hatter's there and everything and you fight him and everything, but it did a good job of balancing the enemies with your allies in who they were, and also just the general selection of them, because the Griffin's one of those ones that's like he's there for about as much as everyone else is, but the Griffin really is an ally in Wonderland because he's just sort of, he's just doing what he's doing, and that happens to be helpful or instructional to Alice. So having him there as a bigger ally is really nice, because that's a character you don't see a lot.
Yeah. It also, I think because of this was something I didn't feel as strongly with Madness Returns, because they were going in a different direction, but the original game had a really fantastic balance of new elements to source material. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of, they added a bunch of steampunk stuff into the Hatter very seamlessly, into, all of the Hatter's lair, and there were no steampunk elements in Alice in Wonderland, but it felt so correct. It felt authentic without actually drawing from the source material. Those spider-legged mask things,
bad.
They were, and again, it fit into the environment, even though it wasn't a thing that Lewis Carroll had penned.
Right.
Like, so much of the stuff that was in there, they matched tone very consistently throughout.
There's also the entirety of the meat castle for the Queen of Hearts.
Yes.
Which really takes a new spin on hearts. And she had a fascination with cutting off people's heads in the original, so why not just expand on that and make a meat castle?
Sometimes
with
you
meat
need to have a
tendrils.
meat castle.
Sometimes there are meat castles, and that's valid? Question mark.
And it was just, it's a good game, and there were other allusions to it that were really good. I think the weapons are a really good source of story building, because you have your default weapon is your Vorpal blade, which it draws from the Jabberwocky, and then they just continued on with that sort of deadly innocence theme. You have the playing cards were a little bit more Alice in Wonderland inspired. The croquet mallet is also very authentic to Alice in Wonderland, but then you have you've got the jack bombs, and the ice wand is just a reflection of one of the settings that you experience, and you've got the jacks, and it's very seamless. And
so then when you actually get to the blunderbuss, it really does feel like a bigger endgame weapon. Yeah. Because you can't really make a blunderbuss a kid thing.
Right.
It's a gun.
It's a big gun.
But, so that's why it feels so important amongst the other weapons.
And it's something, this is one of if I could recommend I know that I can't, because this isn't how recommendations or time works. But if I could recommend that everyone play through the game as a kid and then as an adult, I would. Because it was something where American McGee's Alice was the first game that I ever got real deep into just for the experience. And it was so interesting, because like you said, like the blunderbuss, that blunderbuss is like a very gamer concept, and if you take a blunderbuss into the final battle with the queen, it feels like you're playing like a retro shooter game almost. It's got that it's got that feel to it when you use it. But playing as a kid, and trying to uncover the stuff, you're more likely to come across, like, the blunderbuss is the hardest weapon in the game to find. I didn't get it my first playthrough.
Because there's only, like, 3 places you get it, right?
Yeah.
There's, like, 3 places in the game.
And, like, one of them's hacked. So, like, if you don't hack your game, you have, like, 2 opportunities to pick up the blunderbuss, and they're both hidden. They're both, like, secrets.
Right.
And I wasn't game savvy enough to, like, be finding all the secret areas and stuff, and I didn't get it my first way through, so I played pretty much my first playthrough all with, like, kid toys.
Yeah.
Essentially. But it was a really interesting experience, because as I got better at the game and as I played more games, as I had like more experiences to compare it to, it really does. The blunderbuss is an interesting one, just in how much it shifts the tone of the game from an adaptation into like a separate gaming experience,
into a game,
right?
Really. It's good. It's fun. So then I guess we can then talk about Madness Returns.
Yeah.
And so it was definitely so I never finished American Mickey's Alice on my own. Kat helped me and showed me everything. Madness Returns was the first one I played all the way through by myself, and I watched you do it, because you did your whole run of it in one sitting.
Yeah.
And then I got to play it, and so it's sort of it picks up not where it left off,
right?
But like several years later, because now she's 16 something. She's a teen.
Is she a teen?
She's like late teens, early 20s.
Okay, I was gonna say
something like that. Well, because I was gonna say I was thinking she was a teen because of what's his face's whole thing. What's his name?
Bumpy?
Bumpy, yeah. Dr. Bumpy's whole thing with kids.
I mean, that makes sense, I guess.
But, I mean, in any case, it doesn't really ever talk about it, her age. But it's years later, after she's had all these traumatic visions in her coma. And so it really does start to push out into the real world and seeing how she actually moves through it, and then into Wonderland as a coping mechanism for all the horrible things that have happened and are happening to her.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things. So we talked about an adaptation having like a reason behind it. I don't know if we really talked about that yet. That's in the advice section. But so usually there's a reason behind adaptations. I think one of the best things it does is it does really kind of delve into the way that people with mental trauma and issues are treated and abused by the system and people around them, which I thought was a really great way to go with it, because not nearly enough stuff deals with that.
Right.
And I think it does it in a way that's very tasteful, while also being an excellent gaming experience.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things, because Alice in Wonderland there's always a debate behind how it came into existence, and it's really about drugs and, all this sort of stuff, and it's like, well, we don't know that. You don't have to say it like that.
Right.
But... So, it sort of embraces the sort of dark interpretations that people do get from it.
Yeah.
But turns it into something meaningful. And and I like it a lot.
And Madness Returns, they're both such integral parts to my personal journey as a gamer. Because American Begins Alice was like one of the first games I got into. Madness Returns is the reason why I got a PS3.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was not... Earlier on, I was not huge into console gaming.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like I had a PlayStation 2... But I wasn't, it was one of those things, like, when there were titles I was interested in, I'd pick them up for the PS2, but yeah. I wasn't real invested in the console, and...
You were a PC person.
I was definitely a PC gamer, and at the computer that I had at the time, I actually got Madness Returns for the PC, and I couldn't get it to run smoothly enough, and that was, like, when it was devastating, because I had been waiting so long for this game, and I couldn't play it, and that was what, so I got a PlayStation 3 specifically to play Madness Returns. And for the first year that I had it, I only had Madness Returns and Black Ops 2 because they gave me a discount on the console if I would take Black Ops 2. Target had a deal where you could get like $60 off the PlayStation 3 if you bought the Black Ops 1 with like the game included. So those were like the two games that I had. And I didn't intend to get as into console gaming as I ended up being. It was my first, that's what turned me on to trophy hunting.
Yeah.
Because, like, that was my first platinum, and it wasn't because I wanted to I got addicted to getting platinums super fast after that. Because it was like, I like this, I need more. But my first platinum game, it was just because I loved Madness Returns so much.
Right.
And I loved it for all the same reasons. It was more focused on this version of Alice than it was on picking up themes from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but it still picked up some of the themes that they had missed. You get the pepper grinder.
Yeah.
You get the catnip cannon.
You get the hobby horse.
And it's, yeah.
I think because, so there's far fewer weapons you get in Madness Returns, because I think because
Madness Returns is made for the console.
Right. Whereas it had been made for the PC previously for American Geese.
That's one thing I will say about that, because you can't... So I had a hellish experience playing the first game on the PS4.
Oh, it was so bad.
I hated doing it.
And you gotta do it to get that platinum.
Yeah, I know. And it's like, because you can tell that the first one was made for a PC, and you can tell that the second one was made for a console. Because when I did eventually get a PC that would run it, I picked it up for my Origins account. For like a few dollars or whatever, and it's like, I haven't played this in a while, I could go get 100% on the PC, and it's like, the controls are so awkward, and it's like, I don't like this.
But yeah, it's one of those things where it really took what it had done successfully in the original, and took what it could from that to continue the story while also pressing forward in new directions.
Right.
And I think it was just really fun, and it brought back a lot of characters, and brought in new ones. It, again, had that really successful blending new things with the old things, because obviously Dr. Bumby is not in Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
Thank God for that.
Yeah.
But, so, like, the whole...
different book.
The whole doll world, was really sort of original stuff. Pushing forward, whereas the previous ones had been like, there was the Hatter's Domain, and then the Walrus and the Carpenter, obviously.
I did really like there was like the Oyster Theater.
Oh my god, the Oyster Theater
going on, and that was a very creepy, whimsical interpretation of source material.
Right.
That I was not expecting, but was pleasantly surprised by.
I also think it did a great job of sort of bringing in new environments to it, because it really went all out in the aesthetics for the worlds. Because, like, the whole Eastern influence for the whole caterpillar part was really gorgeous, and everything. And I think it's just a good game.
Yeah.
It's just good game, and it really takes the elements from what it's adapting and uses them effectively to do its own thing.
It's good.
It's good. I like it a lot. I want to get my platinum for it so bad.
Yeah.
But hooking up the PS3 in here is a hassle.
Oh, yeah.
Because we already have the Xbox and the PS4
Mm-hmm.
hooked up. And we also have the Xbox 360. So, like, there are too many consoles to deal with. But yeah, so I would really like to get my platinum, but I might wait until the PS5 comes out because, sponsored by PS5 today, guys, because it's going to have backwards compatibility
Right.
on it, which is going to be so good, because then I can finally get my platinum for Madness Returns.
Side note, I was really concerned about getting the Switch instead of, because I was gonna get my own PS4 instead of just like continually stealing PS4s. And but I got the Switch, and I was so worried about it, and then I read about the PS5, and it's like I made the right call.
You did make the right call. I
finally, for once in my life, I'm like one of the only owners of a PSP, so it's like I'm not usually on the ball with when I should or should not get which console. But I was so happy at the PS5 announcement. Yeah. I'm like, yes.
Finally, it's about time. Because they've been slacking on their backwards compatibility.
Yeah. The more I read about it, the happier I am that I didn't, that I held out for it. But yeah, now that we've done that, do you want to talk about worst?
Fuck you, Tim Burton! Jesus Christ! How do you make time travel and Alice in Wonderland boring? Surprise, surprise, we're talking about the Tim Burton Alice in Wonderland films again as terrible.
Yeah.
Because they're bad.
So this is an example of Tim Burton also added a lot of his own elements. And you know what I will say for him? The one good thing that he did, is he did take it in a different way.
That's true.
Like, you look at the other adaptations, and he took the Jabberwock element, and he really focused on that, to the point where it was almost an interpretation of a poem than it was an Alice in Wonderland adaptation.
Which would not have been entirely terrible.
I respect that idea, but the execution was so bad.
I really liked the design of the Jabberwock and like everything the Jabberwock did, and it being this actually huge imposing force in Wonderland.
Yeah.
But it was just there's too many other things. It couldn't it was like one of the things where it was like cuz there's the scene where he like talks to Alice and he's like, I was talking to the blade. And it's like, that could be really interesting if we learned anything about the Vorpal blade or the history or anything about it.
And it, like, I think, because something, when we talked about, like, the good adaptations, it was, like, being able to seamlessly work your own stuff in. But then Tim Burton worked too much stuff in that nobody wanted or asked for that felt very out of place. And I think a really good example of that is, like, the whole overcompensation of body parts thing.
Yeah.
Where it's like, the queen has a big head, so everyone in her court has to have some kind of large prosthetic that they pretend to be ashamed of, and it's like, I don't know what kind of penis envy led to this, but please take it out of my kids' movie, Tim Burton.
Yeah, it didn't need to be there. It was also, I mean, it was just such a terrible design choice, because Helena Bonham Carter is beautiful.
She's so
and
pretty.
she's so easily just could have been a really beautiful and imposing woman.
Right.
And I mean, like, it's like, because there's nothing wrong with that. I think maybe it would have been more interesting if they had sort of gone closer to the source material and cast somebody more like Christina Hendricks as the queen.
That checks out.
But we can't have anything nice like that. because instead we gotta have big heads. It was so weird. It was so unnecessary.
There was also, like, gender was super uncomfortable.
Yes.
Because it was one of those things where it was like, they were, again, it falls into that they were adapting the Jabberwocky and not Alice in Wonderland, because Alice gets there, and they're like, they keep calling her a boy, because, like, there was a boy in the poem, and the prophecy, the, like, weird Jabberwock prophecy thing was, like, a boy, and they I think it was kind of interesting that it could, again, the concept, it was, like, an interesting angle to tackle where it's, like, prophecy doesn't necessarily apply to gender, which is, like, a fun thing that they could have been, but the way that it comes across is that, like, Alice is, like, always correcting people about her gender, and just no one sees...
But, yeah, it doesn't make any sense, because, and here's a hot take they could have done with it, Alice could have been trans.
Yeah. That would have been a take. It would have been a much better take.
It would have been, but Hollywood's not ready for that hot take. But I am. I'm going to use that. I did use it, actually. Say, that is how my Alice protagonist is. But we'll get to that later. But, yeah, I mean, it was just, and I mean, like, because there's a lot of wasted potential in it. I mean, as always, the scenery is gorgeous. Like, the actual world itself was really gorgeous. And I feel like the prophecy with, like, the scroll and whatever, could have been really cool. I also do like the that's not Alice sort of thing.
Yeah.
Like, that's a different Alice, sort of thing. But they just squandered it on the weird romance, the weird sexual implications.
Hate that. Don't like that.
Because, like, Spade, so there's a lot of interesting ideas there, but, like, I hate the fact that, like, she went into the castle and Spade was like, I like large women, and it was like, what the fuck is that?
Yeah, maybe don't do that.
What is this weird thing happening?
And, like,
here.
I think it was also, there were too many waste opportunities with it. I think that it would have been really interesting because Alice in Wonderland is, like, one of the most iconic fantasy projects ever, but, like, when you talk about fantasy, it's so often assumed that you're talking about, like, high fantasy, and I think the idea of having the Jabberwock be, like, a prophecy trope with, like, a war that was impending, you get all of those high fantasy themes into the most iconic fantasy thing of all time that wasn't a high fantasy project, and it should have been such a seamless melding of stuff.
Right.
And that's not what we got, and this is something I was complaining about, I think, the last time we recorded, where it's like, I have really bad luck because I'll ask and ask and ask for a project and I'll pray for a project and I'll get it. And as a kid, you know, all I wanted was Tim Burton to do Alice in Wonderland. And it was just so sad.
Yeah, it was, and I mean, it was one of, I feel like it was right, it was the turning point for Tim Burton. I think it really marked the downward turn in his quality of work.
Right.
Because he's done bad.
Yeah, there was a point that ended with Alice in Wonderland, pretty much, where it was like, if Tim Burton's name was on something, I was there in the theater as soon as I could be after release. And it's like, that went out hard.
Yeah.
With Alice in Wonderland. And then, like, the second one was in theaters, like, a week.
It was...
Even if I had wanted to see it in theaters, which I did not.
Yeah, that's fair.
I wouldn't have been able to go.
And it's, so, what really bugs me about the second one, it really didn't take any of the ideas from the actual Through the Looking Glass.
Right.
First of all, there was no... Because, I mean, like, we had the Red and White Queen, which... for some reason was melded together with the Queen of Hearts, even though they're different characters, which I can get behind making them one character, but, like, if you're gonna do a sequel anyway, you might as well have the different queens.
Yeah.
So first of all, I think it squandered the potentials of its female characters really hard.
Right.
I love a good adaptation of time as a person. You know me, I'm all about the board, don't hug me, I'm scared train.
Yeah.
I love me a good adaptation of time. But holy shit, it was so bad. And it had the elements that could make it good, like the minions being the hours and the minutes and the seconds and that sort of thing, and like the clocks upon clocks upon clocks in the mechanical castle could have been real cool. But it was so boring.
It's one of those things, I think if you were like flipping through Tim Burton's sketchbook, you'd be like, this movie's gonna be sweet. Because like on paper, all these things seem like they would be so cool. And me, who has like a lot, I have so much respect for the art of a bad movie.
Yeah.
But it took me like four sittings to get all the way through the movie.
Yeah.
I couldn't do it for the longest time.
For a movie about time, it's so fucking long. Yeah. And it's like, cause I remember, cause it was like on a night when like Ben wasn't home and I had nothing to do, and I was like, it's on Netflix, I'll put it on and see how bad it really is. It felt like I was watching that movie forever. And it was like, I hate the weird romance between Alice and the Mad Hatter. It doesn't make any sense.
Very uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable to watch, and I think it really squanders Alice's character on a romance plot, when one of the things about Alice in Wonderland is she doesn't need anyone else.
Yeah.
She can deal with everything on her own. She's a powerful and independent person who just gets caught up in things. And I'm not saying you can't do a romance with Alice in Wonderland, but
I am. I'll say it.
Cat does.
And it was something I really didn't like. It was my first warning sign that something was going to be wrong in the Tim Burton thing, which, strangely enough, ended up being the only aspect of the movie I really didn't have a problem with because of the way it was handled. But, like, when they're like, Alice is older and she's at her engagement party and she falls back down the rabbit hole, it was, like, absolutely the last thing that I ever want to see is a romance with Alice in it. Honestly, I don't like it, because I've always kind of prided myself on not being as relationship oriented, you know, where it's like I think one of my best qualities is that I have a sense of self on my own. And that's something that I learned reading Alice in Wonderland from a very young age. And it's like, everyone has stuff like that with stuff from their childhood where it's like, they're drawn to one specific aspect of a thing, and seeing that aspect messed with, it's hard.
Right.
So it's like, but I have a tough time seeing Alice in a relationship and being like, I support this and want this.
It's like one of those things where I guess I'll talk about it a little later on when we sort of talk about our own adaptations of things. Because I had while I was doing, adapting my characters for it, that was one of the things I sort of struggled with before I landed on something that I was like, I think this is, keeps her independent nature, but also in a way that this can be, she can have a relationship. But that's not what we're talking about right now. Right now we're talking about fucking Tim Burton and his terrible movies.
So I saw that in the trailer and I was like, I hate this, but then I went to see the movie anyway, and it was like, because she decides at the end of the movie that she doesn't need to marry Hamish? That she doesn't need to marry Hamish. And I'm like, and it ended on a note where it was like, I'm okay with that. Until I thought about the rest of the movie, where it was like, I didn't like that. But, and then the second one undid, like, everything. that one redeeming, because it happened, like, if you have one redeeming note and it's right at the end of your movie, you're like,
okay,
I'm not crazy about it, but fine. And it, like, I left the theater not nearly as mad as I am right now.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because we didn't have huge problems with it, like, after we had seen it in theaters.
Yeah.
But when you really think about it, it's just like, oh, no.
Yeah.
And it was just bad. It's just a lot of squandered potential for the sake of adding elements that were unnecessary and unfun. Like, and I think that's one of the things about these movies is they just feel unnecessary.
Right.
They don't add anything. They don't do anything really fun and new. They add new things, but they're not fun or enjoyable. And fuck you, Tim Burton. I'm gonna say it again. Fuck you, dude.
Yeah.
Bad time.
Really bad time.
But yeah. And it looks like our last note on the things to talk about is Lovecraft.
I just want to throw in H.P. Lovecraft. Every single H.P. Lovecraft adaptation is either the best or the worst.
Yeah.
And I love it so much. Like, The Reanimator is, like, one of my favorite movies of all time.
Mm-hmm.
The Tomb... not so much. And it's like, I feel that way with, like, games and stuff a lot,
Mm-hmm.
too. Where it's like, because Call of Cthulhu is, like, a ton of fun, but then there was, whatever the fuck that RPG Cthulhu game was.
What'd you like to know?
That was, I don't remember. I've played it. It might be installed in my computer right now, actually, because every few years it's like, I can make it all the way through this little RPG here, and then I always get bored and quit.
That's just how it is.
But it's like, H.P. Lovecraft is a fun public domain guy, because everything that comes out of an H.P. Lovecraft adaptation, if you see that going in, you know it's going to be amazing or terrible, and you're kind of excited either way.
I think it's one of those things where, I would... Here's a fun take. One of my favorite, Lovecraft adaptations is in Scooby-Doo.
Oh.
It's... I know.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound disappointed. I got so excited.
It's... So, in the most recent... in Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, which is a phenomenal Scooby-Doo show, there's an episode where they go to a college, and there's basically a guy who is Lovecraft.
Yeah.
They changed his name, obviously, because that's what you do in Scooby-Doo.
Mm-hmm.
Well, except all the other... In the old Scooby-Doo, when basketball players were just there, and Batman was also. But so they go to the college, because, like, it's like Bella wants to meet, like, the writer guy,
Mm-hmm.
and then all of his stuff, like, he writes a bunch of stuff, and all of it, like, starts coming true. But, and it's just a lot of fun, because it's, like, you're far enough into the show that it's, like, the supernatural stuff isn't really happening, but it's done in such a fun, quirky way, and it's one of the things that Mystery Incorporated has always done really well, is almost fooling you into, this is actually happening.
Yeah.
Sort of thing. It does it so well. And yeah, I remember that episode just being a lot of fun, and like, because there was like, the, like, culprit was like in a Cthulhu costume.
Of course.
Like, that's how it ended up being, and it was like, it's just fun. I think there's a lot of interesting things to be done with Lovecraft that brings it out of why Lovecraft made it scary, because it was one of the things I was reading about, like, good ways to interpret Lovecraft, because a lot of Lovecraft stuff was the horror of the thing that was there, versus what a lot more modern horror focuses on, which is the way people react to that thing being there.
Right.
So I think in adapting Lovecraft, you can have a really fun way of blending those two together, of making something really scary and people reacting to it in a horrifying way.
And I think one of my favorite examples of this, one of my favorite Lovecraft adaptations, and what I thought you were going to say, South Park did a 3-part
Oh, God, yeah!
Cthulhu, and it was like, it's South Park, so they tie in, like, a bunch of stuff, but Cthulhu was essentially their metaphor for the oil drilling crisis.
Mm-hmm.
BP released, like, all of the apology videos for summoning Cthulhu.
Right.
Where you have, like, the oil CEO, and he's doing, like, the sexy apology thing in front of the fire, and it's like, but the whole thing, you know, Cthulhu they've summoned Cthulhu, and it's like the end of humanity and everything, and the reactions, or in typical South Park fashion, you know,
over the top, ridiculous.
They're over the top, they're ridiculous, or people just, like, don't kind of care. It's like, yeah, this is the new headline
of whatever.
You know, it's like the new climate change fiasco, and there's just, like, a very laissez-faire kind of reaction to Cthulhu. They've got the newscasters out there who are like, Cthulhu seems to be doing this and this and this, and it's like, it's you know, it's satire, so it's obviously a very over-the-top take, but it was a lot of fun. And then you have Cartman, who feels like he's been rejected by his friends, so he teams up with Cthulhu, and he's like... Which was just, it was good. And it was in their superhero arc.
Yes, it was.
Which was also an interesting thing that happened. Because it was like, the whole thing was done pretty much as like a Nolan versus Batman parody. Which is weird for like a Lovecraft adaptation. But it was one of my favorites. Because it really did, it tied into what made Call of Cthulhu frightening in a very comical way.
Right. And it did it well. It's one of those things where I'm not a big South Park person, but I do remember watching those episodes and really enjoying them.
Yeah.
Because it was just, what the fuck?
And I watch a lot of South Park, but every now and then there will be like an episode or a trilogy of episodes mid-season where it's like, I think Alan is going to appreciate this, and I thought of you, like, as I was watching it. It's like, Alan needs to see this arc.
But yeah. It's fun.
It's good.
But yeah. So those are some Lovecraftian things. And then, we're moving on to the advice section.
Yeah, we're gonna give you some advice.
So it's the basics of adapting from the public domain. So I guess we'll sort of go through these, and like we both have adaptations of stuff, and we can sort of reference those while we're working.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and start that.
All right.
So the first point we have on here is to know your source material.
Yes.
We talked about this in the beginning. If you're going to adapt something, you should research it.
Live and breathe your source material.
And
know the ins and outs and everything.
And
know what people are saying about it.
Read what other people have done with it. If you can, read, watch, play other adaptations of it. See what you like, see what you don't like. I mean, we both have Alice in Wonderland stuff that we've worked with, so obviously we've read the book multiple times. I've played the game, I've played the Madness Returns, I've watched movies, I've, read manga. It's like, there's just so much out there, and you can really gauge what's been done, what is being done, how you want to sort of take a new spin on it.
Yes.
So it's very important that you know what's going on with your source material, because anything can happen.
Yeah.
So, and then, again, this sort of ties into knowing your source material. There's write what you know and love.
Yes.
Because if you're passionate about something, I mean, that's probably why you want to adapt it in the first place, is you want to bring a new take to it that you feel as passionate about.
And I'm not going to say that this works 100% of the time, but mostly for adaptations, you can tell if someone was a fan or not. I think the time that I really lost most of the respect that I had for J.J. Abrams was around the time, because and I talk about this I feel like this is pretty much the Cat Complains about J.J. Abrams not knowing how to scale science fiction podcast. So it was an issue he had anyway, but when people started calling him out on not knowing how to scale the Star Trek reboot, his whole thing was like, I was always a Star Wars fan. And he wasn't quite that douchey about it, but that's pretty much how he came across to Star Trek fans. Because it's like, there are so many people who love and were like so deeply impacted by Star Trek, and one of them really should have been heading the franchise.
Right, that's only fair that someone who really cares about it and wants to see the series grow should be heading a project like that. That's such a big deal, because there's plenty of them in Hollywood.
Right.
Arguably, somebody that worked on Star Trek at any point, maybe would have been good for that.
Would have been absolutely great. And, you know, like, people who were, and I think, and I feel so bad, because I never talk about it as much as I should, but one thing that I really liked about, the third installation of that was you could tell that Simon Pegg was like more invested in Star Trek, like as he was working on stuff, and I thought that was really cool. I liked it.
It's like
it shows. The one downside is that sometimes if you get too, there are also examples of like really loving something and then still you like it for not the same. I don't want to say that there are like wrong reasons to like stuff inherently, but if you like a very specific aspect that like the main culture behind something doesn't embrace, I'm just gonna skip ahead. Tim Burton's Dark Shadows.
Oh, yeah.
Like, we all kind of thought it was gonna be like his comeback movie because he had talked so passionately about Dark Shadows so many times. And it was the same with so many of the people who worked on the project. And watching Tim Burton's Dark Shadows, you can see that what he liked about Dark Shadows were all the mistakes.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Like, he liked the campiness and the inconsistencies and the stuff that, like, it was charming in the series, but it wasn't what made it good.
Right.
And that's all that the movie was. And it's like, that's not really... So... it can fail you, but as like a general, if you can talk to people passionately about stuff and they don't look at you like you're crazy, it's a good sign that you can adapt that thing.
But temper yourself.
Yeah.
Also. And I think that's one of the things about Tim Burton at this point is nobody says no to him. It's like what happened, it's like with George Lucas. Like, no one said no to him because the first 3 Star Wars movies were such successes, so no one said no to him, and so all the mistakes that had been edited out of the first 3 were really prevalent in the next 3 because no one said no to him.
Right.
So also, no matter how much you love something, listen to your criticism. And people are going to say no to you, and you should probably think about why, and maybe respect that.
It's something I'm really, I'm just gonna throw all of my favorite people under the bus today. It's something I'm really worried about, because James Wan has, like, his all-time fantasy project is to work on, like, Batman movies. And, like, Aquaman I had issues with personally, but it was fine. And it's like, but he did it, and he proved his point, and now it's like, when he goes after those Batman movies, no one's gonna tell him no.
And they probably should.
And, like, his background is in horror.
Right.
I don't know, like, doing good with Aquaman doesn't necessarily mean... And I'm just worried that no one's going to, like, be like, no, I know better than James Wan. And you need to have people like that work with you.
I mean, you need to have book slappers.
Yeah.
To be like, hey, this is stuff, and this is how things work.
Right.
Because I do have a lot of respect for James Wan.
Oh, yeah.
But, I mean... just because you're in charge of a project, you always need to have somebody watching your back and be like, hey, maybe not. Think about it like this instead. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah. So it's important that you do love your material. I mean, there's also something to be said. Maybe you don't love the way something was executed, but if you love the concept behind it, I think that's something that doesn't get done a lot, is people remaking things that were bad.
Yeah.
Like, I would love to see, like, bad movies remade with their same potential.
That's something that, because it's like, if something works, Hollywood's like, that's gonna make money, and when someone's like, we should remake it, they're like, that would make a lot of money, because the first one made a lot of money. And it's like, we really, as a society, in regards to remakes, need to look at things that didn't work and figure out why they didn't work and remake them so that they do. Because there are so many brilliant, I think it's movies specifically, for like, there are so many movies that have had such amazing concepts that just failed, and it's like, let's not focus on the failures, let's focus on like the concept and making it better.
So I think one of the only examples I can think of this with, Little Shop of Horrors.
Yeah.
The first Little Shop of Horrors was made from scraps of other movies.
Yeah.
But since it's been adapted into, like, the musical that we all know and love, and, like, so I'm not sure if it was adapted to Broadway first or if it was adapted to the movie first.
I think it was Broadway first.
I think it was Broadway first, and then they made it into the musical, and then they did a reboot.
I think it was tiered like that.
Yeah. So the first Little Shop of Horrors was terrible, and then it became a Broadway darling, because they took the potential of that story, and, you know, they had the campiness that it was, like, made from scraps of other movies, and they embraced that campiness while also pushing forward with, you know, a comically tragic story.
Yeah.
One of the things that always gets me, because I haven't seen the, it was the 70s or the 80s when they made the movie?
I think it was the 70s. I think it was the late 70s.
Because one of the things, so I started with the musical. I started with the new Broadway musical from like 2000, whatever, was the first time I read Little Shop of Horrors. And what always gets me is the fact that in the movie they gave it a happy ending. Because that was always my thing, because I remember I was watching like 10 dark endings that were cut from movies, and it was like, they listed like the Audrey 2 takeover. Little Shop of Horrors spoilers?
I'm just gonna throw this in here. If you have an alternate ending and you feel like a movie sucks, the problem was that you didn't stick with the original darker ending.
Right.
Because Little Shop of Horrors, like, campiness and ridiculous, everything aside, it's one of my favorite movies. I have so much love for Little Shop of Horrors, and Steve Martin as singing
so funny
sadist dentist is my favorite thing ever, and if that was like the whole movie, it would still be my favorite movie ever, honestly. But
he's got a thing with playing the upset individuals in musicals.
Yeah, that's true.
Because he's also got Maxwell going on over there. Anyway.
But if they had kept the original ending, it would have been so much better. The ending is so good. And it just, and it's, because I've also, I know the list you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because that was my first exposure to the I Am Legend end.
Yeah.
That they adapted from the book. It was different than the book ending, but it explored the same things thematically, and it was so poignant and so beautiful, and it
fucked it up. But yeah, so it's not one of the things. So it's not a critical flaw in the Little Shop of Horrors movie, because I mean, like,
because you still have a good time.
Yeah, you still have a good time, and I mean, because you do want to see Seymour and Audrey get a happy ending.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's also, you know, it's not as effective as Audrey 2 eats everybody and takes over the world.
Yeah.
There are consequences to your actions. But yeah, so that's one of the things that I also think. You can love the concept behind something and not love its execution, and then take it and do it better.
Right. My favorite... I think one of my favorite things, and there's something to be said even just like for taking elements of something to improve, Jigsaw spoiler.
Oh, shit.
People really didn't like Saw 4.
Yeah, that's true.
The ending was bad, and there was a lot to be desired in execution. I'm just gonna come out and say it. The plot twist for Saw 4 worked really well in Jigsaw when they just flat out reused it and are like, hey, twist! And you're like, what, huh? But it made sense in Jigsaw, and you're like, oh, that's what Saw 4 should have been like. It was weird that they used it again, honestly, because there were a lot of other things they could have done, but, like, they took a concept that didn't work from earlier in the franchise and they kind of, like, cannibalized it into something that was better.
Right.
I'm not gonna say it was their best option, but they did it.
But it worked.
And it worked in, like, a weird way. It was, like, nice. So, yeah, like, you can take elements and stuff, but there's something, I think you have to find that line, because if you change too much stuff, it shouldn't be an adaptation. It should just be an inspiration kind of a thing.
Because there's nothing wrong with just taking inspiration.
Right. Like, there was a lot of plot inspiration in the Martyrs remake. Mm-hmm. But if you go in expecting Martyrs, you're going to be sorely disappointed because they missed every single theme of the movie.
They missed a lot of things.
Yeah. Do you want to pause this real fast?
Right. So the next point we have on the list is, so when you're doing your adaptation, think about the things that the original says that you also want to say in your work.
Right.
So I guess this is a good time to go to our own experience with adapting things. Yeah. So where should we start?
Do you want to start, or
I'll start. A project I had previously been working on was an Alice in Wonderland adaptation, where I sort of took the themes of Alice in Wonderland and put them into a purgatory sort of world, where the person who enters purgatory is called Alice, and Wonderland is sort of constructed from their memories. And it was one of those things where, so Alice in Wonderland has a lot of, like, the independence and learning to navigate difficult situations around you, and, you know, embracing yourself, sort of thing. So that was one of the themes that I also wanted in my story, is sort of, you know, pushing through, you know, purgatory, based on your own strength, and the memories of what you've done and what you can do in the future. So that was sort of something I was working on. It's not a project I'm working on anymore because I've sort of evolved the different parts into different things. But it was something I was really passionate about when I was working on it.
Right.
So, you know, there's a reason you like something. So embrace that when you're adapting it.
Yeah. That's important.
Yeah.
I was working on an Edgar Allan Poe adaptation, and I wanted to take it in, like, a really different direction, but it was The Mask of the Red Death, and one thing that I picked apart, like, Mask of the Red Death and thought about what it was that drew me to that over any of the other Poe adaptations that I could have done, and what I came out with was the sense, sort of, that because of privilege or because of station, that like other problems won't apply to you, that you're like falsely protected, you've got like this padding, and so I took that and I twisted kind of the whole story, and I told it from like a different point of view that was a lot more abstract. It was like very deity based, but I made sure that the theme also like showed consequences for them to kind of keep that theme going. And then there was also, and this ties back to knowing your source material pretty well, I took back, I kind of time-stamped my chronology for the story with the colors that were based off of rooms from the original story. Because in terms of imagery, other than like the really violent death imagery that you get, the titular mask, if you will, I got that was like the imagery that really stuck with me, was the different colors of the rooms. And so I made sure to incorporate that in my adaptation, even though I was kind of trying to take it into a different way. And I didn't incorporate it into rooms specifically, I tried to do something else with it. So there was like that balance of making it my own, but taking what I had loved about the story initially.
Right. So, there's always things that you can just take in a different direction and keep, because that's one of the things, is someone who also loves the source material, when they're reading that, they're gonna notice that you have done that.
Right.
And it's, it's another fun thing for people to pick up on. That's one of my favorite things of adaptations is, they took that thing, it's not public domain, but, like, that's how I am with the Thor movies.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, they took this thing from the mythology, blah, 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 because I'm a big nerd. But yeah. So our next point is, ask yourself if it needs to be an adaptation.
Yeah. And this is something, because again, there's that line where it's like, if you change enough stuff, it's not really an adaptation anymore, it's a new thing, which is fine. But you need to decide, it's mostly a marketing decision, I'd say, more than anything, because there are pros and cons to doing adaptations, and I think one of the biggest pros and cons is that it comes in with a built-in audience.
Yeah.
And they're going to be more excited and more there and more active, but they're also going to be a lot more critical of what you do. So you need to decide kind of if you want that to be built in. If you're doing, and I think a really good example of this is Dracula, because there are so many Dracula adaptations, but it's one of those things where it's like, if I say it's a Dracula adaptation, there are going to be Dracula fans, and there are certain things that it's going to be dangerous if I change, where if you do some other kind of vampire mythology, if you're like trying to create your own creature mythology, it arguably would be better not to do a Dracula thing specifically.
Right, because as it turns out, no one's gonna mind if it's not an adaptation.
Yeah.
That's never something, people love to get invested in new things and bringing new takes to mythology. I think it's also an important thing that even if you are adapting something and you're keeping it as an adaptation, you also have to make sure, so you have a built-in audience already, but you have to make sure it's accessible to new audiences as well. You can't rely on the fact that it's an adaptation to carry you all the way through.
Right.
So, like, my example for this is, like, the Castlevania series on Netflix. I've never played a Castlevania game in my life. But I really enjoyed the Netflix series because it's done really well. Like, it's really enjoyable. There's a lot going on. So there's stuff there for me as not a classic audience member, but as a new person getting introduced to it. But there are, like, iconic things from the series that, like, people are going to know about.
Right.
So, like, I haven't finished season 2, but there's a line I expect to hear somewhere in there because that it's, like, the line from Castlevania.
Right.
So, you got to sort of take your adaptation in strides of everyone who's going to view it. Sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, I should finish Castlevania, as it turns out.
That's fair.
Well, you said Dracula, and I got excited.
Yeah, you got
So, yeah. So, our next point is, you have more leeway when you're adapting from the public domain, and you should use that wisely.
Yes.
And
this is something, this is a good time to have this point, because Alan brought up Castlevania immediately, which is not a public domain thing.
Right.
But it's, again, because there have been a lot of adaptations of, there's been, like, the one really big popular adaptation of Castlevania, and you get, like, a lot of Castlevania fans in there, and the series was well done, it was well received, but it had that built-in critical audience, and it had to have achieved that high standard to not be torn apart.
Right.
There's a little bit more leeway. There have been a lot of Dracula movies, and it's one of those things where, I mean, you have Bela Lugosi, who's like a really wonderful actor who pretty much created the on-screen Dracula that everyone knew for years and years. But then you've got like Christopher Lee, who came in, and it was a different adaptation, and at the time there was already a built-in fan base that was ready to not like Christopher Lee as much as they liked Bela Lugosi, even though it was the more charming, eloquent Lee version that has derived into the on-screen vampires that we see today.
Right.
So it's just, but like if you did decide that you were going to do a vampire thing and you wanted it to be an adaptation, there have been a lot more mistakes with Dracula than with Castlevania. So it would be like, people are used to seeing a wider variety of things, and copyright infringement aside, it's a safer space to work in, but you have to be careful because there aren't going to be people who are like checking you.
Right.
If you buy the rights to something, if you're working in someone else's work where, you know, they're still alive and can criticize you.
Right, exactly. So
then at least you're going to be kept in line by someone.
Right. Because, I mean, and it's one of the things that you're always gonna run into. There are always going to be purists of source material.
Oh, yeah.
But, I mean, that gets sorted into the extreme fandom spaces.
Yeah.
And, I mean, like, sure, I'll agree that in some things there are elements that you should not change.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, of one in particular. I can't even think of one right now, but,
okay, if you're gonna do, like, a Pride and Prejudice adaptation, Heathcliff has to be there. Like, Heathcliff. I don't know who I'm talking about.
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about Wuthering Heights now. Oh, boy. I have to go to bed. Right now on the podcast.
It's fine. It's like almost, it's 6. Cat?
No, but Mr. Darcy has to be there.
Yeah.
Or if you're talking about Katrina, I guess, because I'm doing Wuthering Heights, maybe. No, if you're doing Pride and Prejudice, like, Mr. Darcy has to be there. And if you're someone like me, who doesn't like romance, Mr. Darcy was probably your whole problem with Pride and Prejudice. But if you're gonna do an adaptation, he's gotta be there, because he was the story.
Right.
Like, he wasn't the protagonist, but he was the story, and if you don't have him there, it's not gonna be Pride and Prejudice. So, like, you have to, even if you're not someone who likes romance, changing that would change the entire concept of what it is, and there are ways to do it. Pride and Prejudice and Zombies is, like, fantastic, but they didn't get rid of Mr. Darcy. And there were people, like, I mean, I was there mostly for the zombies, but I was, like, happy.
It's also, like, so if you're adapting, Romeo and Juliet, you have to have a Romeo, you have to have a Juliet, and they need to be in opposite factions somehow.
Yeah. Having
them on the same side does not work, because that negates the point of the story.
Exactly.
As it turns out. If you're gonna sort of negate the point of the story in the first place, unless it's like a problematic thing that you're trying to work into being better.
Yeah.
Maybe don't do it as an adaptation. Maybe just do a different thing.
Yeah. And I mean, that works too. Like, there are some things, there are these sort of AUs that have been more successful or as successful as the original.
Like Jane Eyre.
Like Jane Eyre. Except for Mr. Darcy was still there. It was a different guy, but it was him. We don't know it was him. Because he was an idiot. Blind idiot. Anyway, spoilers for Jane Eyre. He's blind at the end. Oh boy. Mr. Rochester.
Yeah.
Anyway. But they're like... And it's one of those things where it's like they were obviously adapted. They obviously drew a lot of inspiration from... But... they weren't really marketed as adaptations.
Right.
The Lion King.
Not an adaptation of Hamlet.
It's not an adaptation of Hamlet. It is basically Hamlet, but that's not... They weren't like, where they didn't go into the pitch room and they're like, it's Hamlet but with lions.
Right.
Because, like, you would have been like, I don't know about that. I don't know how I'm feeling. And, like, you know, Wicked.
Right.
Is, like, you can spin off from stuff, and even if it's obvious, you don't necessarily have to immediately tie yourself in. Wicked did more than, like, The Lion King. But,
Right.
I mean, you know, it took it in a different way, and it embraced that it was something different that it was doing.
Right. And I mean, I think it comes from the difference between adaptation and fan fiction.
Yeah.
There is a difference.
There is a huge difference.
Because, you know, because Wicked is basically Wizard of Oz fan fiction.
Right.
Because, and the reason I think it's not an adaptation is it's an adaptation of the characters, but it's fan fiction because it's not the same story at all. It's taking the characters, adapting them into a different setting, but then telling a completely new story with it.
Yeah.
And in this essay, I will talk about. But yeah, I love Wicked. I think it's great. I should read the books at some point. But they're long.
Yeah.
And they're long. But go see the musical. The musical's great. I saw it on Broadway. It was so cool. There was
Also,
a huge mechanical dragon.
go see Les Mis. It's in the public domain.
Oh my god, Les Mis. Don't. I guess you can watch the movie. The movie's eh.
Read the book.
Read the book. Oh god. Huh?
Yeah.
Do what?
Read the book.
Oh, that's so long.
It's good.
That's true.
Real good.
Musicals. We're not gonna get too many musicals. But I realized Little Shop of Horrors is not a public domain thing.
It's not.
I just got back to that. Anyway, so consider other adaptations of the same thing. We sort of already talked about this.
Yeah.
Know your source material.
Yeah, know your source material. And again, it's one of those things where it's like, it was something that I struggled with when I did, like, my first long-term Alice in Wonderland adaptation, because what I wanted to do was a scary Alice in Wonderland, and one of my favorite Alice in Wonderland things had already been gorified.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like, a lot of it was finding ways that I could take these elements that I love and do it in a way that hadn't been done by someone else, because it was like, I knew I wasn't going to make anything scarier than American McGee's Alice.
Right.
But I tried to make it scary in a different way.
Right, and that's one of those things. So, everyone's seen horror Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
Very few of these stick out besides American McGee's Alice.
Alice in Murderland.
Okay, we're not going to talk about Alice in Wonderland. That's not the worst adaptation of Alice in Wonderland I've ever seen. Purely by the fact that he's hilarious to watch. So yeah, it's like, you're gonna have, and I mean, it's one of those things with fairy tales and like Alice in Wonderland and like classics, there have been a lot of adaptations,
Mm-hmm.
but you're not gonna think about many of them.
Right.
Because there's gonna be one that does it the best, so you gotta sort of try to not, you don't want to be doing the same thing as everyone else does, because in any sort of creative thing, I mean, that's poison. Because no one's going to remember it. It's just going to be another drop in the pond that you don't remember. But yeah. And then, so next is only pursue it if you feel like you have something new to say or add. Otherwise, it's going to show.
Yeah.
For example, so I'm running a D&D campaign
Mm-hmm.
right now that's based around, like, the whole thing is themed around fairy tales. Like, that's the underlying motif of all the quest lines, and, like, because, like, the main antagonists are the Brothers Grimm.
Yeah.
That's their title. But so it's one of those things where I'm sort of taking the fairy tale elements to tell different versions
Mm-hmm.
of the story. Cinder is my version of Cinderella, and he's a trans dude who was raised by his father until his father remarried, and his father was like a great hero.
Yeah.
And then his stepmother killed his father as part of the bigger plot by the Brothers Grimm to take over the area.
Yeah.
And so now Cinder is sort of struggling with becoming a hero in his own right after he's been cast aside and never finished learning how to become a hero himself.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of how I'm trying to make Cinderella more interesting, because Cinderella is one of those things that, I mean, like, it's fine. It's okay. I've never had any real strong feelings about Cinderella.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's one of those things, when I took Cinder, I wanted to make them a more interesting character who leans towards good, but doesn't always know what good means.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, I mean, it'd just be another thing.
Right.
But yeah. So yeah, say new stuff with your stuff.
Yeah, it's something that you really, that's what people are going to remember, is what yours did differently and what the message behind it was. So it's something to look at. It's something that here's like my weird, timely adaptation for the public domain, because The Wizard of Oz is something that you see adapted a lot. You see a lot of adaptations of it. I think my favorite, they did an episode of Scrubs that was The Wizard of Oz.
What?
And it sounds kind of dumb and hokey, but they took the themes. I think what I took away from the Wizard of Oz episode of Scrubs, everyone had like their own side arcs that they went through, but the main thing was that it was that sometimes just you need to appreciate what you have there, like in the moment. And it's something, it tied into really well the original theme of Wizard of Oz of wanting to get home and having this journey home, but it was being content and not realizing maybe that you have something that you don't. But it struck kind of a similar but slightly different note. JD's whole thing, he's been on like a 48-hour shift or whatever, and he's just trying to get home from the hospital, and he can't do it. But it's just like, it was a way to tie like fantasy into what we generally associate as a very grim setting of like a hospital room, and it was good. It was like, but it kind of hit on the note that we don't necessarily have to live in a fantasy world to have these like adventures and these like longings for home. And it was good.
It's fun.
Scrubs was a good show sometimes.
Sometimes. It had good times.
It had good moments.
I was going to get off track, but I'm not going to. So the next bullet point we have is make stuff more inclusive. This is really important because, in American culture, things are fucking white all the time, and they're white, they're heterosexual, they're boring. I shouldn't have said that out loud, but I did. But yeah, so, I mean, obviously my specialty is, it's one of my artist missions, is to make more inclusive content. Like I had said previously when I was doing my Alice in Wonderland adaptation, I made Alice trans because fuck you, she can be. And then, like, when I'm working on my D&D campaign, it's like I have a little list of genders and stuff, and I make sure it's all balanced, because, having non-binary and trans and gay and bisexual characters is just not something that you see in a lot of these fantasy settings or these retellings, at least in the mass market.
Right.
There's a lot of independent creators that do that, and it's sort of one of those things that you need to keep pushing for. Because, as you know, we're very about creating inclusive content.
Yes.
Please do it. All I want is a trans main character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's something also, because there are a lot of different kinds of inclusivity. When working with adaptations, unless the exception is if you are a minority and you feel very passionately about something
right.
That you would like to adapt, I think you absolutely should. If you're a white person and you're trying to be more inclusive, I think this is territory where it might be better to start fresh with your own thing.
Yes.
Because for like just a big, I think it's just one of those situations where you can, right now it should be more about trying to create stories for minorities instead of trying to rewrite things so that they were included.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's necessarily a creative point, just as that's kind of what we need right now in society.
Yeah.
It's not like an all the time rule, but I think that's kind of where we're at. It's something that I think it's one of the reasons why like Black Panther did so well,
mm-hmm.
is because we didn't go back and we're like trying to market another Spider-Man, but
mm-hmm.
and it's like the exact same story, but like we have like a black Spider-Man, and that like we went back and we had a black superhero, and it was like part of his identity, and it wasn't. Yeah, and I think that's what we need. I think we need more people who are doing stories like that from informed positions. And then there's also, because Into the Spider-Verse
beautiful
was one of the reasons why I brought up Spider-Man. I think if we had just like gone back and rewritten Spider-Man, it wouldn't have worked. But having something like Spider-Verse that was just that supported inclusivity in a Spider-Man environment without just like telling us the same Spider-Man story, was the next step. That was also something we needed.
Right, and it's one of those things where Peter Parker's story has been told so many times. He's had so many reboots.
Yeah.
So finally getting, because Miles Morales has always been a lot of people's favorite Spider-Man.
Right.
He's now my favorite Spider-Man after watching Into the Spider-Verse. So finally giving him the big screen attention that he deserves, I thought was really great. And so I would also like to see other adaptations of the other Spider-Mans. Like, there's Miguel is one of the ones, because he was like at the very end.
Yeah.
With the best stinger I've ever seen in a movie. But yeah, it's, so I'm going to talk about one of the things. So after Stan Lee passed away, people made, like, a big deal, about a comment that he made that said, I don't think Peter Parker should be black. So they took that quote out of context.
Yeah.
So the context was, he was like, when I designed Peter Parker, I, designed him, like, as a white male. And in creating another Spider-Man, I think it would be more interesting to create a different Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Instead of taking Peter Parker and, like, just changing his race to, really embrace the fact that you're writing a different Spider-Man who's coming from a different position, a different culture, like Miles Morales.
Right.
And I think, it was one of those things I saw on Tumblr, and it really got under my skin after I read the article, because, I mean, people were trying to make him look like a bad person after he had just passed away, and it was like, don't do Stan Lee like this.
Yeah.
And I mean, me speaking as a white person, I am coming from a place of privilege, but I do think there is, truth behind that, and I think it's, like, with public domain stuff, I think it's, good to, in your retellings, do that different sort of backgrounds and cultures and thing. But I think it's more than a situation of just changing the race. Because if you're retelling a story in America with a black man, that's going to be way, like, they're going to come from a totally different position than a white man would.
Right.
So, yeah. It's one of those things also, I think when adapting things, I think we are at a point in our society that I think white writers pushing for inclusivity should, like you said before, go for the new content. And I think if a person of color wants to rewrite a classic with people of color, I think that's sort of their territory.
Let them do that.
Yeah, because it's their representation.
Yeah.
And they're gonna have way more information on it.
Yeah, it's one of the. That's always kind of a tricky situation because you don't want to only have white characters.
Right, that's never good.
But you also don't want to step on anyone's toes. And it's one of those things, you need to consider your own background when you're doing adaptations of stuff. You can't be like, I think that we should have more adaptable public domain works with people of color. I'm gonna do it as a white person. Like, it's...
Right.
It should, in theory, be done, but... know what you can and can't pull off.
Sort of know your sort of place in the creative field.
Yeah. And when working with inclusivity, I do think that the LGBTQ community is... It's something I've seen a lot of recently where it's like they're more inclusive in their public domain adaptations, and that's something... it's something that I feel definitely more comfortable working on myself, and it's something that I hope that we do continue to see more of.
Yes.
In our community, because that's also important.
It's a lot. Being inclusive is very important because everyone wants to be able to see themselves reflected in a body of work.
Right.
There's a lot of talk about like forced inclusion, and it's like, have you stepped outside your house recently? Where do you live, my dudes? But yeah, so inclusivity is important, and know how you can best do that in your work.
Yeah.
For where you are. The next one, I'm gonna let you take the lead on, portfolio tie-ins.
Yes. So this is something, it's working on a collaboration or an adaptation, working on any kind of big work is something that's going to attract attention. And it's something that's really good for a portfolio tie-in. I originally did my Edgar Allan Poe, my few adaptations. The year that his stuff went into the public domain, I worked a lot on Poe stuff, and originally I was doing it for anthologies, but it ended up not... I got into some, like, weird, unsettling stories territory with a few of them. That didn't work out so great. But they make for, like... really interesting portfolio pieces because it's something that, it's not the most original stuff that I've ever done, obviously, because it is an adaptation, but it shows, I think, a lot of what I can do. Mm-hmm. And there's still that pre-existing fan base for it. It's been nice to have some Edgar Allan Poe inspired work on my portfolio. It has led to a lot of interesting conversations. It's also something really good for artists, I'd say, especially if you can team up with a narrator. There are a lot of projects right now that are reading public domain stories online, and it's something where it's like if you as an artist can get into the thumbnail for one of those, it would draw a lot of traffic. It's something that my art friends can do. I am not going to, because art's not what I do. But I have been thinking about trying to get one of my Edgar Allan Poe things narrated. Because it's just like, and this is something we talked about a lot on, like, we talked about it in portfolio making and again for social media, but you have to kind of think out of the box on how you want to get your name out there, and doing public domain tie-ins is a good way.
It's a lot cleaner than doing, like, fan fiction pieces, because, because here's the thing, is a lot of the artists I follow, I did get attracted to them because of their, fan content, because I'm like, I like that thing, I like the way you draw that thing, I'm gonna follow you. It's one of those things where I've been doing a lot of D&D art.
Yeah.
And Dungeons and Dragons is a weird one, because it's very based, as a fantasy adaptation.
Yeah.
But it's very much his own thing, and it is very much copyrighted.
Yes.
So it's one of those things where I sort of do it in my free time, because I really do enjoy, like, the current D&D campaign, we're doing now.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't have any of it in my portfolio because I'm not even gonna take that risk that something in my portfolio will be flagged.
Right.
And I mean, like, Wizards of the Coast are, like, pretty cool dudes, but, like, I'm not gonna risk that shit. And I mean, that's one of the things is there are certain things that are not in the public domain that people do get really, big for and sort of sell their portfolios on. One of the really big things, like, at anime conventions, is you'll see a lot of Pokemon art, you'll see a lot of, like, video game stuff, and, a lot of people do have Patreons and stuff based around that. But some companies are going to hit you a lot harder than other ones are.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in the same country. So, like, Nintendo sort of wavers back and forth on how hard they hit people, because they can go all out or not care at all.
Right.
Like, I'd say it's good to have definitely public domain things are going to be recognizable in your portfolio, and someone's going to be like, oh, that's a real cool take on this thing. Like, there's this Red Riding Hood game I remember playing that it was like a spot the difference sort of game, and you had to, like, find all the things. But it was in this real, like, gritty post-apocalyptic landscape, and I remember it being so cool.
Yeah.
I wish I could remember the artist, but I played it when I was younger, so, like, I don't remember anything.
Right.
But that sort of imagery is going to stick with people if they already really love something.
Yeah.
So people love public domain things. Stick it to them.
Yeah.
But make sure it does have that level of memorability to it.
Right. That's a good thing to have generally when you're trying to get out there. But there's also something, because like you kind of said with the fan content, there have been people who have, like, made it doing fan fiction and adjusting into other stuff or getting a fan base from their fan fiction and then edging into doing something else. There are people who have done it very successfully. There are people who have done it very well. But if you're starting out, there is sort of, like, there are negative connotations to fan fiction creators.
Right.
And I don't believe that those connotations should be there, but the fact is that they are.
Right.
So even if you're not super worried about copyrighted stuff, even if you're looking for the fan base more than you're looking for financial gain, it's something where it's like doing public domain stuff is still going to come across as a little bit more respectable generally in the public eye.
Right.
And this is something I used to be guilty of also.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's one of the big ways that I like to think that I've evolved since, like, high school.
Mm-hmm.
But it was one of those things where it was like I was always more inclined to, like, like Alice in Wonderland stuff or, like, high literature content than I was to follow, like, fan fiction creators.
Right. It's an unfortunate connotation that does come across to young people is that there's a certain level of disrespect in doing fan fiction.
Yeah.
Which is just not true.
It's not.
It's dumb. It's cringe culture, and we're not about that in this year, 2019. Cringe culture is dead. Make your rainbow furry personas. And write your fan fiction, but don't put it in your portfolio, probably.
It's also something that I think was probably, like, really negative impact on me, because I wrote a lot of fan fiction, but it was one of those things where it was like, I had a really tough time taking myself seriously after that, because I still had those negative connotations, and it's like, I just do, like, fan fiction.
Right. It's like, oh, I only do this. It's one of the things where, it's, like, if you ask me where half my characters come from, I still sort of hang my head in shame.
Yeah.
I did a lot of Italian fan fiction when I was younger. Like, so much.
You wrote a lot of Italian fan fiction yesterday. No.
Hey, no, I don't do that anymore. I did wear a Prussia shirt yesterday, but fuck you. So a lot of my characters now, I did come from doing fan fiction, and adaptations and role plays and stuff like that. But it's one of those things where I sort of figured out if I really wanted to do content with these characters, I had to make them my own.
Yeah.
And so through doing fan fiction, I inadvertently created a cast of characters that I'm really passionate about.
Yeah.
And I really love. And no one will take them away from me. Ever. I'll kill you first.
Oh boy.
I've got a gun!
Oh.
I don't have a gun.
Oh no.
I pointed my finger at Cat. Because I'm cool and edgy. Narrators and collaborations. We sort of talked about that.
That was kind of like a subset point.
Yeah.
That's a really good way if you can sneak into some narrator channels. Because there's a very thriving narration community on YouTube.
I love it.
Thriving is a weird word, because the side of the community that I'm in just took like another really huge monetization hit.
Well, that's because you're in the horror community.
But yeah,
here we go again.
Yeah.
YouTube, yay!
But there is a community.
There is a
thriving
community.
or not.
And the last point we have on here is read more public domain stuff.
Read public domain stuff. There are a lot of arguments for why no one has as much time as they'd like to read or consume public domain content,
right,
or any kind of content or whatever. There are like a lot of, you can make excuses all day long about not having read like certain high brow things and not having like a good classic basis, but public domain stuff is on the internet for free.
Right.
You're not stealing or infringing. You can go legally read public domain stuff for free, and you should.
It's one of those things where it's like, because we all do it. We all spend our time just browsing because we have nothing else to do. And I mean, I do find, so I am of the type of person that prefers to read short stories.
Yeah.
I like it when things are bite-sized for me. I don't even like it when a video is like more than 20 minutes long. I'm like, that's too much of commitment. But then I sit there for 3 hours watching 20-minute videos.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, like, there are so many short stories that are public domain. Like, I'm honestly probably gonna, when we're done here, I'm probably gonna sit down and read my Grimm's Fairy Tales, because I haven't read it in a while.
Yeah.
Or go read Alice in Wonderland, because I also haven't read that in a while. And so, there are lots of things online that are bite-sized, and the thing about it being online is you can usually find it in more bite-sized formats.
Yeah.
If you're looking at something digitally, so versus the actual physical book of it, like, I would never, like, pick up, like, a big book. I'm scared of them. They scare me, and that's a flaw in my personality. I get intimidated when things look big.
Here's a fun public domain story about Alan. He recently did a very nice thing that I'm going to blast him for on the podcast. I'm collecting these covers, like these special edition covers of classic literature, and Alan recently gave me the H.P. Lovecraft collection, and I was like, I was so happy. It's part of my collection. It's one that isn't available anymore, and it made my day. But I opened it up, and he was like in the middle of he's like 3 pages away from the end of one of these stories, and it's like, Alan, you at least finish this story.
I haven't touched that book in like a couple of years.
I can't take this book away from you in your mid-story. And he looked so disheartened. He's like, I haven't finished it yet. I'm not going to.
I mean, that's just sort of the person I am. I mean, I do a lot better with audio formats, because I am just sort of, my eyes are so bad, I can't really focus on words for a long time.
Yeah.
I also get distracted so fucking easily. But it did give you a nice book.
Yes.
So be nice to me.
Yes, and it's beautiful. It looks so good on my shelf with the other ones. And I'm going to read all of them. I haven't yet. I'm in the middle of a book challenge. Everyone's been calling me out because I was like, in December, I got that really fancy Jane Austen for the collection.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm gonna read me some Jane Austen. And then like I started this book challenge, and I got like 6 pages in to fucking like Mansfield Park, and I haven't touched it. But I'm doing a book challenge. I'm like,
you're reading other things.
in my last book for my book challenge. I'm gonna finish it, and then I'm gonna get back to Jane Austen.
Well, maybe you should read something nice first.
Yeah.
You're gonna read American Gods!
I am reading American Gods.
There you go.
It's my last book challenge book, and it's really good, and I like it. But yeah, there's not a ton of excuse for not reading public domain stuff, because you can, and you can listen also.
Right.
And that's what I told Alan when he gave me the H.P. Lovecraft book, was because, like, one of my favorite horror narrators is Otis Gyrie, and he does a bunch of Lovecraft stuff.
Even though he has old man voice.
He does have a severe case of old man voice. But it's very appropriate for Lovecraft.
I mean, that's true.
Who wrote in old man voice, so...
He also wrote in racist.
Yeah.
But we're not going to talk about that. But yeah. So, you know, if you ever get bored and want something to read but don't have the money to spend, just look up some public domain shit. It's that easy.
And if you're a writer, you should be reading as much as you can. And if you're an artist, and the kind of artist who can listen to stuff while they work, I know not everyone can, and I'm not gonna, like, call out people who don't multitask in that way. Mm-hmm. But, like, when I do art, I definitely like to have something going, and, like, LibriVox is amazing.
Yeah.
You can get through so much public domain stuff on YouTube just listening to LibriVox while you're doing other stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's like I'm big into audiobooks, except for that I've usually read the ones that I find for free.
Right.
But it's like you can get like 20 hours of stuff done. And like if you do a lot of crafting, mm-hmm. I knit a lot.
Mm-hmm. That's true, you do.
And that's good to do to like a nice audiobook. It's very cozy.
You can also do it during a nice long D&D session.
Yes. But not in the public domain.
No, it's not in the public domain. Don't do that. But yeah. So I think that's about our podcast.
Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations? I think it would be fun to start doing recommendations.
Oh yeah.
Like at the end of our
Absolutely. It's something I've wanted to get into because I've been trying to do more recommendations and articles mm-hmm.
For
our online content. So that would be like a nice way to wrap up the podcast.
So I think obviously one of my recommendations is going to be Alice in Wonderland. Like the original book. It's a real quick read. Like even I can sit down and read it, which is saying something because I don't. So I think that's my source material. Mm-hmm. I would recommend. Give me a second to think about like a comic or something.
All right.
For a recommendation.
I would recommend H.P. Lovecraft while Alan's thinking about that. Not just because I like H.P. Lovecraft. A lot of people who like the mythos don't really enjoy reading the stories, and I think that's something that proves that it's ripe for adaptation material, mm-hmm. because there are so many ways it can be improved upon while still taking what makes the original great. And you have a lot of selection with H.P. Lovecraft because he did a fuck ton of stuff.
He did so much stuff.
Yeah.
That book was so big, Kate. I was never gonna finish it.
You didn't have to finish the book, you just had to finish the story. You were 6 pages from the end of it.
The type is so tiny. And he talks so much. Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think of, like, I'm gonna be better about this, because I decided we should do it on the spot, so next week,
right.
I'm gonna, like, actually get, like, a comic to recommend, but, I mean, like, for the adaptation, I'm gonna say, fucking Madness Returns, is a great adaptation. Everyone should play it, everyone should have a fun time.
Oh, this is something I wanted to talk about earlier, in our points, just, Grimm? Play
Mr.
that?
Grimm.
Yeah. American McGee's Grimm. Play
Yes.
Because it takes the point not so much from the source material itself, but from the discussion surrounding the source material, where we have kind of, we've sort of blunted the edges of a lot of fairy tales in society today, and the game is like encouraging us to undo that,
Right.
which I thought was a really interesting take. So for adaptation, that would definitely be my recommendation, and also because it's the game itself is not in the public domain, but Grimm's fairy tales are in the public domain, and you can play the first chapter of Grimm for free on Steam.
Mm-hmm.
So
do that. Also, support the next chapter in the American McGee's Alice series.
yes,
He's out there. He's trying to get it funded. I would like it to happen.
it would be really nice if that would happen.
Because I want to know. I want to know. But yeah. So I think that's sort of our podcast for this week. This has been Unsolicited Advice. I've been Bubblegum.
I am still toxic.
I'm not Bubblegum anymore. I've moved past that. I'm adapting myself.
He's ascended.
We'll see you next week in heaven.